Welcome to writing modern and opinionated React. There's no introductions here, we're just going to dive straight in. And first up, I always think you should use create React app unless you have a damn good reason not to. My rationale for this is quite simple. It's very easy to use, including with TypeScript support. It comes with a great range of sensible defaults, including linting, minification, webpack config, Babel config, so you can write the latest and greatest JavaScript. You get Jest as your test runner out of the box, support for CSS and SCSS, as well as it will auto-prefix your styles per vendor as required, and it will also support static asset imports, so you can work with different file types, SVGs, images, etc., and import them into your components. It's battle tested and proven as well. It's used in a tremendous number of real-world apps out there. And if you don't like it, you can always eject and make changes to the config. But that's also not to mention that it is actively maintained and updated, and more or less within 24 hours of a new React version coming out, you can update your apps created with Create React App very safely. Next up, I suggest avoiding higher order components where practical. So this is where you would wrap one component in another for injecting some logic, functionality, what have you. And there are a few reasons for this, but perhaps my biggest reason for avoiding them is that they're really not fun to type. So if you're writing a higher order component, you need to define the interface for your higher order component, and then same again, but for the actual component you want to use. And then if we move down just a little bit, you can see this is what the higher order component would look like. So we're exporting a function called withTheme, extends withTheme props, and it takes an argument of React.componentType with the name of wrapped component, and we return a new class component with some injected functionality, and then we finally return, or I should say we finally render the component that we're wrapping with it, which here's an example of what a button implemented to use this would look like. So there's a lot going on there. It's a lot to think about. There's really a lot you've got to keep in mind when you're working with higher order components. And they also make debugging a bit more painful than it need be. It's also going to create vastly more complex component trees than you would otherwise have. So here's an example from the Styled Components website where we're inspecting a link in React DevTools. I'm sorry for those that are not too familiar with React DevTools or haven't seen a great deal of it. And what I'd like to draw your attention to, starting at the very top, is context consumer. And we have one provider below that, a few lines down, and then we have another 5 context consumers all the way down because this library in the current version 4, is using higher order components to inject context so that it can access the theme and so on, which is a topic for another time. And now here we compare this where we're inspecting the same component in React DevTools, but this page has been created with Styled Components version 5, which is still in beta at the time of recording. And instantly, if we look, we can see a great deal more of that component tree. We can still see there's a context provider, but you'll notice there's only one context consumer because we're not using higher order components to inject all of that functionality. It is there present in error boundary because error boundary is typically a class because it is only possible to implement that in a class. And so I'd argue that's why that is there. Otherwise, you would see none of that because there would be no need to use any higher order components with this at all. Moving along, you should always prefer function components over class components, but also where practical, which is probably 99% of the time, excluding that one instance that I just sort of alluded to there. The justification here is that functions are easier for humans and computers to understand. There's no use of this, which we'll be diving into. You can co-locate life cycle functionality. We'll also be diving into that. It's a lot easier to share logic as well, which we'll also be talking about. But also because it's the most common component in contemporary React. And so here's just one example of a simpler declaration. We're not using props or state in either of these. This is as simple as it can possibly be. And you can see the function component is instantly recognizable as simpler than the class. And moving on from this, pick a style and stick to it. So what I'm talking about here is declaring functions and what have you in your components. So do either of these. So on the left, we have const handle click with the arrow function syntax. On the right, we're using the function keyword. It doesn't really matter which one you use unless you want to dive into function hoisting, which is another topic entirely. But I guess the point here is just to pick a style and stick to it in your project. Don't mix those two styles together. It isn't nice to look at, it's inconsistent, and it requires more brain power than just the one way of doing it being used universally through your project. ABD, always be destructuring. So we'll start off with an example of no destructuring and a class. So in the render method, we have our return statement, and we're going to put some data out there into the world. So we're going this.props.message, this.props.nest.another one, this.props.data.map. And that's a lot of redundant typing where it's not otherwise required. Commented on the third line is how you would destructure it in a class component. And then you'd be able to get rid of this .props throughout this example here. A great way to destructure when using function components is to do it in line. And so typically the argument that's passed to a function component, the only argument that's ever passed in fact, would be props. And so what you can actually do is destructure in line just like that. And then on the second line, I'm pulling out another property from Nest, although you could do this in that initial declaration. It just gets a bit messy and it's hard to format it for this specific purpose. And then you can see within the return statement, we're just calling those variables directly in the curly braces. There's no props dot something and so on. Also, one of my favorite features of destructuring is that you can rename properties as required when there's a need or it otherwise makes sense. So here we've got something called poorly named item that exists on props.meta, and I've used the colon and then just given it a new name. So I've renamed it to data in this example. My next point is that you should always create conventional component APIs, and there should be absolutely, positively no exceptions to this. So up the top, we've got a component called simple form. It takes good props as its interface. And on that, there are two functions. There's handle submit and handle change. And we can see that handle submit is going on our form element, handle change is going on the input element. And so their intent, their purpose is communicated very quickly, very effectively. It's very clear. And then down below, we have an app component where we're actually going to use simple form. We're declaring handle change and handle submit. And we're keeping the naming consistent across where it's declared, where the interface or the props for a component are defined, and where it's used. So from top to bottom, it's very easy to find what's going where, what it's used for, what purpose does it serve. So then this is how good props and bad props would look in a TypeScript React world. The good props has handle change and handle submit. What they do is very evident. It's communicated clearly and concisely. You could also sub out the word handle for on, and that way it's sort of more of a one-to-one, the event that's going to be called and the function that's going to handle it. Then we've got bad props where we've got a keyboard callback and a form submission. Form submission is probably not too bad really. Keyboard callback is, I don't know. I'm not sure what it is. And that's what we should be actively seeking to avoid. And the purpose here is don't make me think. When I say me, I really refer to, well, yes, me, but everybody. Anyone that's going to be looking at code you wrote or you will write, don't create unconventional prop names. Don't change them between similar components and so on. Keep it consistent the whole way down. Next up, we've got project structure, where there are no rules because it's React and there aren't, but there kind of also are some rules that you should definitely adhere to. So we're only going to consider the source directory of a project in this case, just to keep it nice and simple. So you've got all of the really important stuff in that source directory. You've got your index, type definitions, service worker, etc. But then everything past that should be broken down into folders. So views, we'll take it from the bottom up. So views would be anything representative of a view or a page or whatever you would consider to be like those in your application. Store may or may not apply depending on what you're actually creating, but if you are using Redux or something like it, which you probably will be, put it all in your store folder and then break it down on domain or similar within that. Hooks, this is from where you would put your custom hooks. We won't dive too much into that right now because that's coming up in a bit. But then components, if you're starting on an app or it's a small app, you can probably just dump everything in the components folder. Name your components wisely, of course. But if that folder is getting out of control and a little bit unruly, you should definitely be grouping those in folders in the components directory or the directory in the components directory. You can group them by the domain, the page, some sort of category that they fit into, whatever. If you had a bunch of components for rendering tables, you could create a table folder. You could have a shared folder even for components that are shared quite widely across your application. Next up, we have Art Vandelay, which is to say you should care about importing and exporting. So I have this example here of what is pretty conventional to see in a React app. We're importing React at the top, obviously, but below that, we're importing some other components from a single directory, and then we're rendering them in the app itself. But as you can see, these three components, button, card, and table, they're all coming from the same place. And so there's a way that we can clean this up and make it a nicer developer experience. And so what I'm suggesting you do is in your Art Vandelay folder, or whatever it might be, it could be shared or table or whatever, you would have an index file, TS or JS, depending on the project, of course, and you would export star from a file name. And so that means that in your application, you can group those imports together. And typically that's a really great way of communicating intent to indicate what domain or responsibility they belong to. And it will keep your imports a lot neater and tidier, especially as you build out your application, because if you're like most developers, you'll be writing new components as the need arises, and then you'll import them, or you might actually just start writing them and let your editor or your IDE automatically import them, and so they'll just get added. And so you might have 10 unique imports from practically the same place, and they're all out of order, and it's messy, and it's hard to see where stuff's coming from. It's hard to see where your components are coming from. There's an argument to be made against this, which is that it introduces a little bit of boilerplate, and I can't really deny that. I can't deny it at all, in fact. But it does make it a lot easier to work with, a lot easier to read as a dev. So that 20 seconds it takes to do this could save your team a lot more than that. And so it's worth thinking about it at least. Next up, you should write semantic HTML. The purpose of semantic HTML is to convey meaning. So get out of its way and let it do that, because it's not a great deal of work from a developer's side, really. So here's an example of what's not uncommon, unfortunately, in React, where you would have divs the whole way down until you had a paragraph or similar, or it could be a form even, and everything's got a class on it, and you would style it and so on from that point. Instead, use the HTML that is available. So we use main, header, article, section, and there are so many more great HTML tags you can use that communicate their purpose very quickly. And you've probably picked up this as a bit of a theme, communicating as much as possible to as many people as possible in as little time as possible. And to sort of extend on this, semantic HTML is definitely, I know it says probably, but I've changed my mind, it's definitely your gateway to accessibility. So imagine that you've got a form-heavy React app, which is, probably at least half of them out there, and you've got an input, and you've put it into a component because you want to reuse it. For an extra 2 lines of code, ARIA label and ARIA required can very easily be put in there. And this is a great way to sort of start going down that pathway to accessible React apps. And I strongly encourage everybody to do this. In a similar vein, I also strongly encourage the use of fragments instead of extraneous divs. So let's consider the following JSX example. As you can see, it's called angry react, and there's a reason for this, because when you're returning JSX in a component, you can only have one parent. So if your component only needed 2 paragraph tags or something to that effect, and you had it like this, it would not compile, or if it did, it wouldn't load. So you'd be in for a bad time because you've made React angry. And so historically speaking, the most common solution to this is wrap it in a div. And for the longest time that was valid because there wasn't actually another way to do it. But there is now, and it's been around for a while, and this is what you should be doing. You should be using fragments. And so the first way to use them is by calling react.fragment. So you're definitely importing React in your component. So you can use react.fragment and put everything in between as required. The next way to do it is import fragment explicitly from React as a named import. You can use it like this. And the third, and I think this is probably the most common, and it's definitely my preferred way of doing it, is just using empty angle brackets. And that is a fragment. React knows it's a fragment. And I guess this is probably the one exception to the rule about communicating intent, whereas having fragment is definitely way more specific, but it's not a big deal if you're not using the word fragment in there, in my opinion. And so just to be clear on this, using fragments renders nothing extra, so you don't pollute your DOM with many divs. And moving on from this, let's talk about decomposing JSX into components. I think you should do this when it makes sense. And I've got an example of when I think it makes sense just here. So this is a contrived example, I'll admit that. It's a contrived sort of blog of sorts. We've got items and comments that we're retrieving from functions somehow. And you can see we've got a section and we map over the items, rendering an article, a H2 and a paragraph. And then in the next section down, we're doing the same thing. We're mapping over our comments, rendering an article, a paragraph, and who it was by. And I think this is a great example of, if you see something like this, it's time to break your app up into components a little bit more. And so here we have on the left how the items would look. We're literally just copying and pasting the code from one place to another. And you could take that a step further and create an item component and map over and return item if you were so inclined. And the same again applies with comments. And so in these cases, we're going to pass the data down as props. But of course, you could also choose to get them in line. That would be perfectly fine too. But for this example, we're going to use props. And so actually putting these components to work, we're going to grab that data from those functions, pass them down into those components as props, and they'll be rendered. And so that's the end of this part of writing modern and opinionated React. Coming up next, we'll be going through class abuse resistance education.